Filters and effects. Use the blur gallery. Use the blur gallery to quickly create distinct photographic blur effects with intuitive on image controls. Each blur tool provides intuitive on image control to apply and control the blur effects. With the blur adjustments complete, they use the bokeh controls to style the overall blur effects. Photoshop provides a full-size live preview when you work with the blur gallery effects. Choose filter, blur gallery and then select the desired effect. Field blur. Use field blur to build a gradient of blurs by defining multiple blur points with different amount of blur. Add multiple pins to image and specify a blur amount for each pin. The final result is combined effect to all blur pins on the image. You can even add a pin outside the image to apply the blur at corners. Choose filter, blur gallery, field blur. A field blur pin is placed on the image. Click the image to add additional blur pins. Click a pin to select it and do one of the following. Drag the blur handle to increase or decrease the blur. You can also use the blur tool panels to specify blur value. Drag the pin to a new location. Press delete to remove it. Iris blur. Use the iris blur to simulate a shallow depth of field effects to your picture irrespective of the camera or lens used. You can also define multiple focus points, an effect almost impossible to achieve using traditional camera techniques. Choose filter, blur gallery, iris blur. The default blur iris blur pin is placed on the image. Click the image to add additional blur pins. Drag the handle to move them to redefine the various areas. Drag the blur handle to increase or decrease the blur. You can also use the blur tool panel to specify a blur value. Tilt shift. Use the tilt shift effect to stimulate an image taken in with a tilt shift lens. This special effect blur defines area of sharpness and then fades a blur at the edge. The tilt shift effect can be used to simulate photos of miniature objects. Choose filter, blur gallery, tilt shift. The default tilt shift blur pin is placed on the image. Click the image to add additional blur pins. Drag the blur handle to increase or decrease the blur. You can also use the blur tools panels to specify a blur value to define the different areas. Do the following. Drag the lines to move them, drag the handle and rotate. Path blur. Using the path blur effect, you can create motion blurs along path. You can also control the shapes and amount of blurring. Photoshop automatically composites the effects of multiple path blurs applied to an image. Choose filters, blur gallery, path blur. In the blur tool panel, under the path blur section, specify whether you want to apply a basic blur or a rare sync flash blur. A rare sync flash blur simulates the effects of a flash fired at the end of an exposure. Use the on image controls in conjunction with step 4 to 8 of this procedure. Specify the following settings. Speed. Adjust the speed slider to specify the amount of path blur you want to apply the image. The speed setting is applied to all path blurs in the image. Taper. Adjust the slider to specify a taper value. A higher taper value lets the blur trail off gradually. If necessary, deselect centered blur. You may want to deselect this option if you want to apply a more directed motion blur. The centered blur option helps create stable blurs by centering the blur shape for any pixel on the pixel. In the motion blur effect tab, specify the following setting. Strobe flashes. Set the number of exposures of the virtual strobe flash light. Strobe strength. Determine how much blurring is displayed between strobe flash exposure. Strobe strength controls in the balance between ambient light and the virtual strobe flashlight. No strobe effect is displayed if you set strobe strength to 0%. Only continuous blur is shown. On the other hand, when you set strobe strength to 100%, the strobe flashes are produced in full strength but not continuous blur is displayed between flash exposures. Intermediate strobe strength value produce a mixture of individual strobe flashes along with continuous blur. If necessary, adjust the blur amount at the endpoints. Optionally, adjust the blur shape guides. Select Edit Blur Shapes to view the guides. In the Blur Tool option bar, click OK to commit the path blur effect. Bring your photos to life with path blur filter in Photoshop. Tips for working with the on image control. You can use the overlay control to conveniently create path blurs. Using a control, you first define a path for the blur. You can then define a curve for the path, thereby creating new curve points in the path. Once the path has defined, you can define blur shape guides. Thank you.